usual 5 o'clock Tuesday routine. This week we are very pleased to be joined by Stuart Roberts, who is the Deputy President of the National Farmers Union, who's going to be talking with us about some of the many issues that are no doubt affecting our farming residents and communities at the moment. Just so people know that the way that we do these things is that questions are in the chat box. So feel free to ask questions whenever you think of them in the chat box, and hopefully we'll have time to take all of those, and I'll probably group them together thematically and things like that. Just so people know, over the next week or next sort of week to 10 days, there are lots of training courses that are being put on that they're all free to attend, and we're getting some really, really good attendances at these. And that is a list of the ones that are coming up in the next couple of weeks' time. So if it's okay, I'm going to hand over to Stuart, who's going to tell us about what's happening at the moment from the perspective of the National Farmers Union. Over to you,
Great.
Stuart.
Thank you, Tim. And look, it goes without saying, it's a pleasure to join you guys this evening. Certainly, everything I've heard about the association is extremely positive, and it's good to see one or two familiar faces, such as Sam Collins there, up in my right-hand corner. What I thought I'd do, Tim, if it worked okay for you, is I'll give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of sort of all of the issues, focusing particularly around how COVID has affected the farming community and rural communities in general. I'll clearly touch on Brexit. You and I were talking a little bit about that before. And then I'll do a bit of crystal ball gazing about where I think the issues are going forward. And actually, particularly, hopefully, of relevance to you guys, one or two of the areas where I think perhaps not enough attention has been played locally on one or two things in the farming community that might help you in terms of your campaigning as well. So hopefully you guys will get something out of it in a bit as well. So in terms of COVID, how it's affected farmers varies massively. It very much depends on which sector you have been in. Some sectors have been very, very badly hit. So you will have seen in the news, I'm sure, dairy farmers who were pouring milk away, who had no market for their milk. But other dairy farmers actually haven't been affected at all. And the big switch there, or the big impact there, was this huge change from food service to retail for our food. In terms of the normal course of events, if I go back into pre-COVID days, pretty much 50% of all the food that was eaten out of home, and 50% was eaten in home and effectively bought through retail. Overnight, that moved to thick end of 100% was retail, and that had some really big impacts on the supply chain. And if I take the milk one, for example, there were some milk processors who had dedicated their businesses to supplying the out-of-home trade, so coffee shops, restaurants, etc. Their business was killed overnight. And because of the structure of those supply chains, and this I think is one of the things that will change, I think, going forward, and one of the lessons we need to learn, it was very difficult to switch that supply into retail. So there were certain dairy farmers who were very badly affected. And equally, the other sector of agriculture and horticulture that was affected very badly was the ornamental growers. So those guys who were growing plants for garden centres. Lots and lots of them clearly always lining up for spring, a big area for all of us to get out in the garden. We may well have been getting out in the garden, but the garden centres were closed. So businesses that didn't have an online presence or a path to the consumer were equally badly affected. But, and I think we need to be very careful here, agriculture as a whole was not affected and has not been as effective as many other parts of the economy. If I look at friends of mine who are in hospitality or who are in travel, then actually overall agriculture is one of the sectors that was probably economically least affected. I was listening earlier on to the chief economist at HSBC, and if you look at, if you like, the financial economic impacts on different sectors, then arguably agriculture has been the least affected. But for certain businesses, very, very badly affected. And actually, interestingly, lots of farmers around the country, and many of you guys will know this, have effectively diversified their business. Lots of those diversifications were into things like bed and breakfast and into, if you like, the tourism trade. So they got a hit in terms of that rather than necessarily their farming businesses. Across the food industry, and for me, what am I? I'm a farmer, and often we forget what is at the heart of farming. It's simply producing food. That's the nature of our business, the core of our business. If I look across food, I think one of the big challenges going forward, and something that I don't think anyone has particularly grappled with yet effectively enough, is how we've structured our food industry. So we very much have food suppliers and food processors who will supply retailers and others who will supply wholesale or food service, the out-of-home market. And it's really difficult to switch between those two in some cases. For example, I may be a cheese processor who supplies the wholesale market, the food service market. I produce 10-kilo blocks of cheese. Okay? That's what I do by my very nature. And all of us who then go and visit supermarkets, we don't buy 10-kilo blocks of cheese. And how we build some resilience into the food supply chain, I think will be really important going forward. And we had a couple of occasions where things potentially got fairly sticky and could have turned very, very bad. One was actually on red meat, where the balance of what we buy when we eat out to what we eat in at home is very different. So quite often we'll buy a sirloin steak on a Friday night in the local pub or the local restaurant or the local cafe. We weren't buying steaks. There were steaks all over the country which were not being shifted, but we were all buying more packed mince. We were making more lasagnas, more bolognese, etc. And unfortunately, the animal is made up of an entire carcass, of which some are steaks, some are roasting joints, some are mince. And that carcass balance was a real challenge. Luckily, we actually got the retailers to do some really good work around that and ended up selling in balance. So if you like, that's some of the big food supply challenges, some of the big industry challenges. I think actually the two most interesting areas, though, where COVID has impacted and possibly of interest to some of you guys, and on this, some of you guys will have a direct interest. The first one was we saw a very significant rise in fly tipping. So rural crime and fly tipping is a really serious issue in the countryside. It is something that farmers up and down the country are living with day in, day out, but we saw a massive increase in it going through COVID because, understandably, local authority sites were closed, recycling sites were closed, and equally at the same time, lots of people were using the time as an opportunity to have a good clear out. And unfortunately, that clear out too often ended up on farms. It's something that, and I'd be very happy to pick up more of it in Q&A, because I think it is an area when it comes to campaigning, when it comes to priority issues, and Sam, you will have spoken to a number of guys in our part of the world. I can talk to farmers about Brexit, I can talk to farmers about trade deals, I can talk to farmers about all those big political issues. the one thing that irates them day in, day out is rural crime and fly tipping. And it's something where the penalties aren't strong enough, the deterrents aren't strong enough. And it's also from if I was being slightly mischievous from your guys' point of view, if you're looking to campaign on something and you want something that has an impact in a photograph, a big pile of fly tipping and pledging to do something about it is not a bad place to position yourself if you're after the rural vote. The other area that I found really fascinating actually during COVID is the issue of access and rights of way. Just to put it in context, over the period, over the last 16 weeks or so, I have seen, if I just take my farm as an example, but there's lots and lots of farms who would give the same story. Over the last 16 weeks, I have seen a huge increase in people using my footpaths, my permissive paths. I think it was the Sunday of the second bank holiday weekend in May. I had a thick end of 2,000 people walk through my farm. Now, the farming industry has been slightly torn on this because there are members of our community, as there are of many other communities, for whom footpaths are a pain, the public are irresponsible, and actually for me it's been exactly the opposite. We have welcomed people into the countryside. We have seen it as a great opportunity. The more people who can get out and enjoy the countryside, see what we do and see where their food comes from, has been fantastic to see. And I think actually that will have a long-term legacy in terms of that relationship between farming and the consumer. And the issue of access is one that I take great pride in, and we as a union are really keen to encourage people to get out in the countryside, particularly actually. When I talk to some of my friends who, I was talking to somebody the other day who lives in a block of flats. She's got 3 kids. She's an old school friend, 3 kids. Her husband and her don't get on particularly well. They stay married probably because, I wouldn't want quoting on this, but probably because of the children. And actually, her one release every day when it came to mental health and her own well-being was actually to get out in the countryside. And I think it's something that farmers love to see. So that, if you like, is a bit of a whistle-stop tour on COVID. When it comes to Brexit and where farming is going, the reality is COVID will have a little impact on farming. I hope it will have a positive impact, actually, on people's relationship with food. But actually, in the grand scheme of things, I think it will be a relatively big impact. Brexit will have potentially a huge impact. Somebody described to me once before, they asked me, I was doing a similar thing to this, and they said, can you have your top 3 priorities on when it comes to Brexit? Okay, my top 3 priorities are very clear. They are trade, trade, and trade. Because if we get trade wrong, there is very little we can do domestically to repair the damage. And equally, if we get trade deals right, then actually that is what will be success going forward. So for me, where I watch things most closely and where we are most interested is the issue of trade. And I'm sure you guys have seen the petition we've been running. We've had something like, at last count, I think it was 1,020,000 or 30,000 people sign our petition to protect our standards. We have now had Liz Truss commit to establish the Trade and Standards Commission, something we've been asking for, because it's pretty simple for me as a farmer. I produce, and I'm proud to produce to some of the highest standards in the world, okay? And I can see there's a question already come in on some of this. I produce to some of the highest welfare standards on the planet. I produce to some of the best environmental conditions. And yeah, we need to go further and we need to become even better. But what we cannot put ourselves in a position is to place me in a competition with people who are producing to standards that would be illegal here. It is just simply not on. And if we value farmers, if we value the countryside, if we value the landscape, we cannot allow anyone to sacrifice those standards. And that, if you like, at the moment is the really big issue for us. We will be holding the government's feet to the fire on the commission. We haven't yet seen who will be on it. We haven't yet seen its terms of reference, and we will be working with Department of International Trade on that. And most importantly, we need to see how there will be transparency of the commission to Parliament. This can't be some internal DIT thing. This has to be transparent to Parliament, and we will be continue. But look, we did have a success there, and I hope that's the start of a positive journey. The last thing I'll say, because I know, Chair, I've already run well over my 10 minutes, which anyone who knows me knows I will do that every time. I just thought I'd touch on a couple of things as to where I see some interest in the future. The first one is, I think, and I touched on it earlier on, I think people's relationship with food has changed. We are seeing and have seen recently much more cooking from scratch. We have seen people asking much more about provenance. We have seen, partly because of our standards, but petition and other things, people more interested in where their food comes from and how it's produced. I think that has changed. I think that isn't just a brief period of time, and I think that will be something that's very positive. I think the closer we can get people to food, and it's very interesting. I was doing a question time thing 2 or 3 weeks ago with Daisy Cooper on this, and actually she absolutely agrees. I think that relationship has changed. I think that's for the better. The last thing I wanted to touch on, and is actually probably arguably could be the thing that has the single biggest impact on agriculture over the next 50 years, okay, is not COVID. I don't think it'll be Brexit ultimately. I think that will have a huge impact in the short to medium term. But the single biggest impact will be climate change, for a number of reasons. One, first of all, there is probably no other industry that is more exposed to climate change than agriculture. We were talking, Tim and I, just before the call started, on my farm, we have had the wettest 24 hours in 10 years on this farm. We've had the wettest February, the driest May, and possibly, depending on how much rain I get between now and midnight, the wettest June that we've ever had. We are absolutely at the forefront of climate change. But most importantly, we also see ourselves as the solution to climate change. There are very few other industries that not only use carbon, but are also a carbon sink, are also able to sequester carbon. And we think we have set ourselves an aspiration for the industry to be net zero by 2040. Now, look, some people will tell me that's not soon enough, okay? And I get that. But the reality is we have set a big, ambitious target for ourselves, and we are serious about getting there, and not just setting some arbitrary number. We have a plan for how we will get there. And it revolves around a number of things: improving our productivity, it revolves around greater sequestration of carbon, it involves energy, and a whole range of other issues. But going forward, I think for me, climate change is also a huge opportunity. If you look at most forecasts and most projections going into the future, one of the things the UK will have is water. And I think this is a really big issue. We have not talked about water enough as a country. We have not invested in water infrastructure as a country, but we will at least have fresh water. Now, at times, and I said it earlier, at times we have too much of it, and those of you that have been underwater this year will know that. At times we don't have enough of it, and often it will be in the wrong place, but we will at least have it. And when I compare with places around the world, such as I was over in California at the back end of last year, where they are irrigating crops in an area of America where there are citizens in urban areas who are short of fresh water. When I look at some of the areas in Spain, for example, actually we will have the natural resources to grow food. So I am very optimistic about the future, but there will be some challenges. And I think I've touched on most of those, and probably ought to stop now and crack on with some questions, Tim.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stuart, and lots of topics touched there. If it's okay, we'll just start with Brexit, if that's okay. So there's a question submitted in advance from somebody from your area, from Hertfordshire. So during the 2019 general election, our activists in Hertfordshire spoke to a good number of farmers, especially in the areas around Kimpton, Whitwell, Wheat Hampstead and Harpenden, which I think you know well. They all told us that they were deeply worried about a post-Brexit slump in food standards. Did the NFU tell the same thing to the Conservative Party? And if you did, why do you think they ignored that advice? How did it make you feel when your local Conservative MP directly ignored that advice?
So for starters, I was probably one of those farmers who also said that. Sam's nodding, so I was. That's all right. Because I was just trying to figure out. I knew where the question come from. Look, for me, we absolutely have said that to every politician, and I don't care what colour that politician comes from, what party they are standing for. For me, it is the number one priority for British agriculture. I was disappointed, I'll be very honest, I was disappointed with the agriculture bill when the amendment was thrown out. But for us, the key objective has been to get the Standards Commission, because the Standards Commission is the thing that can independently tell politicians where we need to go. I think there is a discussion about amendments in the House of Lords. I'm pretty sure we will see the Neil Parish amendment return in the House of Lords. But let's also be very honest, within the, and you touched there about what did we tell the Conservative Party. Within the Conservative Party, there are different factions, okay? I don't need to tell you guys that. You know more about them than I do. But there are a group of free traders for whom effectively they're trying to build the Singapore on the, build Singapore on the Thames, okay? And would sacrifice agriculture and a number of other areas to pursue that free trade. But I also believe there is a very strong element of pragmatists and realists and people who do take standards seriously. And what we're seeing at the moment, let's be very honest, what we're seeing at the moment is a battle effectively within the Tory party between those two factions. In terms of my local MP, I talked to him quite a lot about this. I believe he is one of those who is a pragmatist and wants to protect standards. It's about finding the right mechanism for doing that. But equally, you know, there are a number of people for whom, you know, agriculture will be, you know, the mining industry, and we will be free traders and at that extreme end of that party. For me, that is not an area I would ever want to go, and that's why we're pleased with the Commission. But look, there is still a lot of work to be done on that until we have seen the formation of the Commission, the terms of reference of the Commission, and also seen it in legislation. This can't be some, you know, cheap quango. It has to be something real. So look, we will talk about our standards to every single politician, and farmers will remember politicians who do not stand up for standards in this country. No doubt about that whatsoever.
Okay, thank you. So just on a related issue, so I think one thing we have seen with the COVID crisis as our food distribution system has been stress tested, hasn't it? Like never before, and I still can't buy flour in Greater Manchester. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. But and I guess we're all looking at the 31st of December coming down the tracks quite quickly. So linked to that, so Richard asked, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years on food security. The UK imports a huge proportion of its food. What do we need to do to improve our food security and protect our ability to feed ourselves?
I think it's a great question, and something we've argued for a long time. If you remember, you may remember the Agriculture Bill when it came out in its first edition, maybe 18 months, 2 years ago. There was zero mention of food security, and we kicked up quite a fuss around this. I am really pleased, actually, that the current version of the Agriculture Bill does recognise the importance of food security. I've got to say, reporting on it every 5 years is certainly not frequent enough. But what do we need to do? We need to make sure we back our own producers, and that's in everything, every aspect. So we need to support them improving their productivity. We need to make sure there is better transparency in labelling. So a lot of the discussion around trade, for example, and about this, the product coming here that will not meet our standards. I ain't worried about that in a retail shelf, okay, because it'll be labelled. Where I worry about it is the food service sector, where there is no labelling regulation. So I think that's an area that is really important. And I think if we can get that right, then farmers are ready to produce more. And I think the public expects them to produce more. A very interesting one, though, is it's not just the food. So Tim, I love the example. I don't love the example. I hate the example. But the flour in Manchester, okay? And don't worry, you can't get it in Harpenden either, okay? So we're both in the same place. It's not because there's no flour there. It's because we haven't got the ability to bag it. So the real challenge we had at one stage in the food, and this isn't farming, this is the wider food supply chain, is there was lots of flour about, but certain factories only had the ability to put it in 25 kilo bags. They couldn't put it in kilo or 2 kilo or 500 grams, which we take. The other one was eggs. People have been struggling to get hold of eggs. This is one that's been pretty regular. I think they're better now. That's because McDonald's have lots of eggs. Okay, so there's plenty of eggs in the system, but they're white eggs, and we only buy brown eggs. That's what we've done as a country for years. Whereas the Americans and the French buy white eggs. And I think there's a whole load of lessons around how we can improve this, and America has gone even further than us. So in America, they had real problems in the, I think it was in the pork industry, because basically, if you were selling pigs to a particular processor, they only sold them into food service. There was no other outlet, and you could not switch processors. And for me, we need processors, we need a food supply chain that can mix between those two. And for me, that's where the resilience is. So that actually all that flour that was going into making McDonald's burger rolls or was going into local cafes is able to be relatively easily switched into retail, or the other way around, because we don't know where the future will be. So there is, I think overall, let's be honest, British retailers did a pretty good job at continuing to feed the nation. You know, once we've got over that original sort of worry around panic buying and some of the challenges there, and somebody said to me, they said, "Oh, we need to make sure we thank our food producers and our farmers for feeding the nation, right? We need to give them a clap on a Thursday night." I was very, very anti this, because what have we done? All we've actually done is just done our job. You know, people ask us to feed the nation, and that's what we've done. And there's nothing particularly special about that. We're not heroes. There are heroes in some of this, and you know, in the NHS and elsewhere. But all we've done is just got on with our job and produce food. But we do need to make sure that the supply chain is able to support that food security point that was made, and not simply look at developing ever longer and more complex supply chains that we have seen. And not only from a how do we feed ourselves point of view, but also about how do we make sure and retain there's integrity in the food supply chain. We don't have to go back many years to see some big problems. The horse meat one was a classic. Why did that happen? Ultimately, because they were very complex supply chains, and where you get that, people can interfere in it. And food fraud is a pretty big rife industry, and one we all need to watch. And therefore, short, safe, secure supply chains that start on British farms and end up with British consumers is definitely the way forward. And we need to see government policy support that going forward.
Okay. So some questions about rural crime, if that's okay. So the first one from Stephen. So, in rural North Yorkshire, we're trying to make better use of mobile CCTV cameras to catch fly tippers, but we sometimes struggle to establish who owns areas of farmland where we want to site cameras. Is this something that we can work with local NFU branches to share information?
Absolutely, definitely, yes. It's something we've been doing in Hertfordshire. And look, I would encourage all of you to make contact with your local branch. You know, we're a very interesting organisation in some ways that, you know, we still have, you know, in Hertfordshire, for example, we've got 5 different local branches. They know their area, they know their farmers, and even if they're not, even if the person whose land it is you're looking for isn't a member, we will at least know who it is, can help you. So please, absolutely yes. You know, if people are looking to make better use of CCTV and the only barrier is not knowing who it is, then please get in touch with your local branch. And if you're having problems figuring out who the local branch is, then please use our political office in Westminster, and they can point you in the right direction of who to talk to.
Okay. Is there a list of branch contacts on the NFU website?
There is, but I've got to say it's not necessarily the easiest thing to navigate. I would suggest, Tim, the best thing to do, if you could circulate, you've got Rocky's details, I suspect, or certainly Ed had got Rocky's details. We'll circulate the London office details, and if you want to get in touch with your local branch, then please do so. The other thing, they're always really keen, obviously they can't at the moment particularly, they're really keen to have people who come and speak to them. So certainly at any time, you know, local councillor showing some interest in rural issues in that area, and I can talk, you know, globally and in my area and national issues, but in terms of talking to farmers about local issues, then the local branch is really keen. I will, if I get a chance in a second, I will put up a link to our contact map, which has also got the regional offices, just so that everyone's got that to hand.
Okay, just sticking with fly tipping, I guess. The NFU has done some work on the problem of disposable BBQs, which I presume you mean barbecues. Yep. A number of council groups, such as the Lib Dems of Chesterfield, are looking at what they can do. Can you let us know what the specific issues are about these products, and what would you like councils to do about this?
So it's the specific issue with disposable barbecues is when they're being used in inappropriate places, in inappropriate conditions. So the absolute classic is, let's take Chesterfield. So somewhere up on the moors in very dry conditions. And we've certainly seen that. Certainly some of the big wildfires last year were almost certainly caused because of it. Now, I'm not... the NFU has not called for some huge widespread ban, but we have said either through signage or through local rules, there are certain times of the year where there is a particularly high fire risk, and it is absolutely inappropriate to use disposable barbecues in those places.
So now for something different. So what role do the NFU What role do you see the NFU playing in confirming the facts around the environmental impact of rearing animals for meat and dairy, and what work is being done to identify and encourage more environmentally conscious farming practices? As a conscious vegetarian, and there are hardline vegans as well, and some parts of the farming industry saying opposing things, it's hard to know who to believe.
I think this is an excellent question, and I think is one that I've got to say it's one last year I got asked a lot, and then because events have sort of taken us over this year, not so much. For me, this gets to the heart of what we talked about earlier in terms of provenance. So what we are doing and have done actually is we've produced, and again I will make sure at the end I put a link to it. We have put up, produced a document which is all independently sourced evidence. Now, for me, livestock and the way livestock are painted is you would have thought that livestock are the be-all and end-all to solving climate change. And if we all know the one, stop eating meat and we'll save the planet. The reality is there are very different. You don't need to look at livestock. You need to look at the production system that is used to produce that livestock. So if I take South American beef production, okay, now we'll conveniently ignore the deforestation point. Okay, we'll come back to that in a second, but let's just conveniently ignore that. Even then, carbon footprint of South American beef is 4 times higher than beef produced in this country. If I look at beef in this country, it is amongst the most sustainable in the world. Why is that? That's because what we do is we produce grass, okay? And at one stage, I'm not sure, Sam didn't know me in these days. At one stage, I weighed 28 stone, okay? I was absolutely enormous. And I looked like I'd developed a rumen. I was the first human being who was able to digest grass and grow. Okay? I couldn't. No human has ever been able to do it. But 65% of the agriculture area in this country can only be used to grow grass. Okay? You can't grow carrots if there's only 2 inches of topsoil. And what ruminant animals do is they take that cellulose and they turn it into high quality, nutrient dense protein. Okay? Sales pitch over. But what we do is we lump all meat together. So we say, you know, beef is beef is beef, and it isn't. We need to have a much better way of differentiating between, as the questioner asked, between different production systems. So actually, what were the welfare conditions that were used on that farm? Was it predominantly grass-fed, or actually was it using huge volumes of cereal, which cattle are not very good at converting into protein? And I think the document we've produced starts to get under the skin of some of this, but it also gets to some of the facts. So one of the really interesting ones I find is I think there's a real opportunity for British agriculture to lead the world in climate-friendly food. There are 264 million cattle on the planet producing dairy products, okay, so milk, cheese, etc. If they were all as efficient as a UK dairy cow, you'd only need 73 million. So just think about the impact that positively can have on climate change by actually just having less animals and having them more efficiently. And for me, we ourselves as an industry have not been good at telling the story of British agriculture and British livestock. I think ultimately that there is a narrative around possibly, you know, for quite a few people, eat a bit less, but eat better, ask questions about it, tackle the questions around provenance, look at where it was produced. And I think it ultimately that then comes back potentially to standards. But I think it's a really good question. And look, there are people in my industry who are at an extreme end, okay? And there are people in the vegan movement who, let's be very honest, they are extremists in any way or form, okay? And I don't have a lot of time for those extremes. I think, unfortunately, in today's world, and I blame Brexit and various other things, unfortunately, the only people who get a voice are those who inhabit the 2 extremes of politics or any issue. And actually, those of us who inhabit the middle ground, who want to know where their meats come from, and actually who enjoy meat and knowing where it's come from, actually that voice gets lost in the mix of the extremists at both ends. And we just need to be way better at talking about these issues, whether it be this or a whole range of others. Sorry, I'm going off on a slight tangent there. I'm preaching Liberal Democrat policy there, I suspect, in terms of the pragmatic centre, but that's clearly I'm apolitical, so that would be unfair.
We can be radical sometimes, don't worry. So a couple of questions about the future of farming, if that's okay. So yeah. Caroline, who is from Devon, asks, the farming industry is made up of a massive range of businesses, from large arable farms to small family highland pasture farms. What are the prospects for these different types of businesses, particularly thinking of smaller farms? And John, who is from Cumbria, says, if you were a Cumbrian sheep farmer, what do you think you would be planning to do at present?
Oh, they're great questions. So first of all, I go back to let's go back to the Brexit bit. Part of it is you can't actually answer that question until we know where we end on trade deals. Okay, so if trade deals are got badly wrong, if we don't protect our standards in this country, then the consequences for farmers, big or small, livestock or cereal, you know, it doesn't matter which sector, the consequences could be very serious. However, I'm a small, relatively small family farmer. We've got 300 acres in Hertfordshire, okay, which is pretty small for Hertfordshire. I think the future for livestock farming, I think, is really rosy, because we've got the production system that the rest of the world want. There are other production systems around the world that are unsustainable. So long as we don't destroy our industry and trade deals, I think there's a really, really positive future for big farmers, for small farmers, for family farmers, for tenant farmers. But ultimately, it does depend on having that right policy framework. If we don't protect our standards, if we don't protect our trade, if we don't value our farmers, not just for the food they produce, but also, let's take Cumbria there. I think it's a great example. The Cumbrian sheep farmer, right, produces sheep. Okay, that's what they do. Okay, they produce wool, they produce lamb, but they also produce the landscape that is Cumbria. And for me, we sometimes forget that we love the British landscape. If I go away on holiday or on work and I fly back, there is nowhere in the world that has that tapestry of green that is the British countryside. And yes, in the past, we as farmers will put our hands up and we've got things wrong. You know, if I go back to the 70s and early 80s, when I was a young kid on the farm, relatively young kid on the farm, we probably used chemicals inappropriately. Yes, we did rip up hedgerows, but that's not today's agriculture. Today's agriculture is planting hedgerows. It is working with the environment, and we need to do more. And ultimately, that's the bit we need to get across here as well. But if you want to have that fantastic countryside, that fantastic tapestry, if you want to go back to the mental well-being, the positive aspects of access in the countryside, you need farmers there. And I think the public actually get this. I'm not sure politicians always do. And from that point of view, I see a very, very rosy future, so long as those extreme, and as an example, those extreme free traders don't look to sacrifice agriculture for the sake of another sector of the economy.
Okay, a few quick points. So you mentioned that there was an NFU plan for 2040 carbon zero. Could you point us in the right direction for where we might be able
what I was going to suggest, because I've promised you 3 things, and I'm not quick enough to talk and type. If I email them to you afterwards, or email them to Ed or someone afterwards, do you want to circulate and I'll do there was the locations, there was the livestock document, and there was the net zero document. I'll send you all 3 of those over.
Okay, no problem. There has been some announcements today about possible changes to the planning regime, which I think the press was saying is sort of a particular agenda for Dominic Cummings, in particular, to wanting to give us an easier planning regime. So does the planning system work for farmers, and will suggestions of dramatic change to the system help or hinder farming?
So on the Dominic Cummings and any announcements today, I've got to say I haven't seen those announcements, so I can't talk in detail. I think in terms of planning, in general, it worked reasonably well. I think we've certainly seen where I would like to see possibly some changes is perhaps sometimes the pace it takes, but I understand that. So, for example, and actually here's a really good example. So I think I've just put in, or about a year ago, I put in for planning. It was on a permitted development to improve productivity on my farm. I'm also looking to harvest a load of rainwater. It's something I'm really, really excited about at the moment. And Sam, you're more than welcome to come and have a look at it and talk agriculture at the same time and have a photograph in front of it. And Actually, the planning of that was relatively straightforward. I wouldn't have any issues. Where there have been some challenges in some of the diversification, and I think that's where probably there is room to improve planning. But equally, we've got to be careful we strike the right balance when it comes to planning. And you know, for me, I'm a farmer. I have the most stunning office in the country. There's no other industry that has an office like mine. And we need to be really careful. So I think it's about, for me, planners and planning, understanding what agriculture is trying to do. So actually, how are we trying to improve our infrastructure? And on my farm, for example, I've got some fantastic traditional buildings that are full of house martins. Okay, they are, in terms of biodiversity, they're probably some of the best buildings in Harpenden. They're also of absolutely no use whatsoever in terms of my farming operations. So I think it's how we strike this balance between preserving that, which has a really important value, but then equally letting me use the planning system to then invest in infrastructure that can improve my productivity, which can reduce my carbon footprint, which can allow me to put more into the local economy, etc. And I think with farming, it's about how we strike that balance. And I think that'd probably be about where I'd go at the moment. But in terms of today's, I'd need to have a proper look at them. Sorry.
Okay, something completely different. How can councils best support farmers facing mental health challenges or issues?
I'm really pleased to see this question. Mental health in farming is a really big issue. If I go back 5 years now, if I talked about mental health with a group of farmers, let's put it this way, the least of my worries was whether I would get elected as deputy president, okay? Actually, today, it is much better. We're talking about it. But farmers are like me, okay? They're big, butch, macho blokes, okay? And we don't have feelings. We don't have anxiety. We don't have worries. We don't have stress. But yeah, we do. We're just not very good at talking about it sometimes. One of the things I think where local councils could help is just about sometimes not forgetting those communities are there. It depends on which part of the country you're in, but certainly I do see councils seeing almost being dominated in some areas by urban issues. And I get that, I get the number of people, I get the electorate, I get the rest of it. But actually farming and rural communities can be pretty isolated places. You know, quite often a number of, we talked earlier about sheep farmers in Cumbria. There's a friend of mine who farms not far from Ravensglass. He may go a week without seeing a human being. Actually, one of the things that councils could also do there is remember the important role that things like the auction market play. Because actually the auction markets, yes, they play an important part in a functioning supply chain, selling animals from one farm to another farm. But they also play a huge part in the mental well-being of the community. And also encouraging farmers to talk about mental health. I have this thing at the moment that I try to give people permission to talk about it. And we're great as blokes, aren't we? Farmers, whenever we see each other, and I'm sure Sam, actually I keep picking on Sam, sorry. When Sam and I see each other, I suspect we'll give each other a big handshake. And each time farmers do this, they get slightly harder. The handshake gets a bit firmer, and we're all trying to prove who's more macho. And we say, how are you? And we say, I'm great, I'm good, I'm fine. And we all forget there's a question mark at the end of how are you? And I think sometimes just giving people space to talk about mental health is really good. And just being reminded, it's a silly thing. At times we feel beaten up, okay? So we're causing climate change, we're killing the planet, we're killing people, we're drenching the fields with chemicals, you know, we're cruel to all the rest, all that stuff, and it gets us down, okay? So as local councils, one of the things you can do is just remember farmers, talk to farmers, invite them to come and speak to you, because actually we are a community. We're a really valuable community. And I think sometimes just somebody reminding us we're valued could have a huge impact on that community. Sorry, that was a very long answer to a very simple question.
It's okay. A few more questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
If food standards are lowered, do you think we'll see an increased risk of further pandemics through a move to larger and more intensive farming?
That's really interesting. In this country, no, I don't, because I think we could be faced with a very interesting quandary. And look, we will do everything we can to not allow food standards to be lowered. If we import product into this country, I think farmers will be torn in a very difficult place, because we will be being outcompeted by product coming in, but at the same time, we will not, and rightly so, we will not be allowed, society will not allow us to carry out those practices that happen elsewhere. We wouldn't want to, but even if we wanted to, I don't think society would. So I don't necessarily see it causing more pandemics from that point of view. Where I do see it causing some challenges, if you like, in that area, is actually if we look at the production standards that are used elsewhere, actually there are greater risks. So actually, if we look at stocking densities, if we look at other countries, they do produce it. Lots of attention is paid to chlorinated chicken, okay? And the reality is, chlorinated chicken is not the issue, okay? It's why do you have to chlorinate the chicken in the first place? That's the real issue. The reason you have to chlorinate the chicken in the first place is because of the production standards that sit behind it. And the UK has a simple approach. When it comes to meat, and lots of people don't want to talk about this, but the reality is when it comes to meat, we start with a clean carcass, and we keep that carcass as clean as we possibly can, as hygienically as we possibly can, and put in front of the consumer the safest product you can possibly have. In America, they take a different approach. So people talk about the chlorine being the problem. Chlorine is not the problem, because actually their approach is they clean the carcass up at the end. So the real problem is actually if anything goes wrong in the decontamination process at the end of the line. And there are some quite interesting, I haven't got the statistics at the top of my head. Yeah, there are some interesting statistics around food poisoning in different parts of the world. So I think there could be impacts. I think drawing a straight line between lowering standards and more pandemics, I think is probably an unfair one to do, but there would be consequences, and there'll be consequences for animals, there'll be consequences for consumers, and probably the argument gets made that lowering standards reduces the price of food. Okay, it's good for the consumer, it brings in cheap food. Okay, first thing to remember is we've got the third most affordable food in the world in this country already, and the highest standards. And also, if we rely on someone else to feed us going forward, that food may not always be cheap. And I think the other bit in this, and I get really frustrated when politicians use an argument that says, yeah, but what about all this food poverty in the country, and cheap food will be good for that. I don't believe in food poverty. I think there's poverty, and I think it manifests itself in food. And I think that's a really big issue going forward, which is, how do we get more equality in the availability of food and the affordability of food? But cheap food, standards and why, if you're on a low income, why should you compromise your ethics around animal welfare or around environmental protection or food safety? And I think for me, that whole area is a really big area, and that's opened up a whole nother discussion, I suspect. But I think for me, food can also in that, sorry, I'm rambling slightly, but there's a point I want to make. I think actually food can be a real good for fixing division. I touched earlier about division in society. One of the things I'm really interested in is actually how can we use food, which is at the heart of every culture, is at the heart of all of us. It's something we do 3 times a day. How can we use food and food availability and provenance and standards and all those other things to actually be a real force for good in wider society, not just in how do we get 2,500 calories in ourselves every day. I really did stray there, Tim. Sorry.
Don't worry, don't worry. I promise I'll go back to rural crime if that's okay. So detect is one of the biggest issues when it comes to rural crime, i.e. knowing that somebody's doing the crime and witnessing them doing it. How can the police, local authorities, etc., support farmers to better detect crime? And do we need investment in security solutions? If so, or if not, what are the potential solutions farmers would like to see?
So there's a number of so one of the solutions we really want is actually, once they are detected and once they are prosecuted and once they are convicted, anything you guys can do to help us raise the issue of proper fitting penalties would be useful. Fly tipping is a classic. There was a farmer, a neighbour of mine, who he put up some CCTV. He had some fly tipping. They found the man, they convicted him, they prosecuted him, and then they gave him a sentence. And the fine he received was less than the cost of a skip he would have had to have hired in the first place. So that's not a penalty, that's just the cost of doing business. When it comes to helping catch people, I think the CCTV one's a really interesting one. And actually now with some of these wildlife cameras and various other bits and pieces of technology, you can do it relatively cheaply. And I've seen councils around the country who've sort of bought the equipment and then they'll move it around amongst the farming community. I think the other thing that's really good, and I don't know if councils can get involved in this or not, but there's some really good WhatsApp groups being developed. We've got a couple on the Herts Beds border and another on the Herts Cambridgeshire border, I think, where farmers are starting to share what they see. But equally, farmers need to be reminded about how to deal with evidence. That's the other bit here. So what you do, and I've seen it too often, you'll see some fly tipping. The farmer will rifle through the fly tipped litter. He'll find an address on an envelope, and then he'll take that and either put it on social media or he'll give it to the police and say, right, this person needs prosecuting, not understanding that that's the scene of a crime. And I think one of the things that would be really useful is you guys getting out and talking to the local branches, talking to the local farmers about what help they need. Because quite often the farmers will know who the people are. The farmers might not, though, have the technology that can help find it, or have the list of rules, if you like, where if it happens, this is how you treat a scene of a crime so that evidence can be properly collected. And from it being properly collected, you can then possibly have a chance of a prosecution. But we also need to look at the penalties. But all of it is just by ultimately building relationships with your local groups. And look, it's slightly remiss. I've done Liberal Democrat conference the last couple of years. I've done a few fringe events. I've never heard of this group. Okay, that's wrong. It shouldn't need you guys to reach out. We should have known about you and we should have reached out to you. But I think through all of this, it's about building relationships, both with the farming community in your area, with your local branches and with others. And farmers are desperate to talk to people about some of these things. But if you want two things that will win you, well, certainly will win you plaudits. It's then to turn those into votes, but that's your job, not mine. But that will certainly get you a lot of credit with the rural community. Then yes, the trade stuff and the rest of it is really interesting, but go after fly tipping, rural crime.
Well, there you go. Stuart, this has been a really, really interesting session. So thank you so much. And I think most of us, even in semi-urban areas, have farmers in our wards that we represent. So it's been really useful to think about how we best do that. And as you say, thinking towards the really important local elections in not too many months now. So that's been really useful. Thank you so much for your time. And if you send us those links, then we will share them to the people who've participated.
I will send you those links, Tim. It's been a real pleasure. We spoke beforehand and said, how long does this go on for? And you said, usually it dries up after 45 minutes. for which I apologise. I've obviously spoken too long, but one thing I will say, and I try to take this opportunity, lots and lots of people in society have opinions, okay? We've all got opinions, but a few people do stand up to be counted, and anyone who is a councillor, who is taking on issues, you know, I think we are all indebted to everyone who's in public life. I see quite a lot of it at all levels. And look, thank you for listening to me, and hopefully taking on board one or two of the things I've had to say. And look, best of luck to everyone who stands for an election. And as I say, good luck in elections coming up.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.